The classroom had never been so quiet. You could have heard a pin drop on the scuffed linoleum floor, still sticky from last night's rushed mop job. 30 pairs of eyes locked on the woman standing in front of the blackboard, her breath trembling, her pale blue blouse torn clean down the front. One dangling button swung like a cruel little pendulum, marking the seconds as humiliation curdled in the air. Her name was Miss Larkin. She had arrived just a week earlier, fresh out of her teaching program, her cheeks bright with a kind of hopeful nervousness. Some kids had whispered that she looked too young to be a teacher, that her voice was too soft, that she'd never last. In this school, the rumor went, softness was a scent predators could smell, and they had smelled it. At the back of the classroom, Trey and Mason, the unofficial kings of homeroom 7B, were grinning. Their faces shone with a smug pride that only came when someone else was suffering. To them, it was a game. How far could they push the new teacher before she broke? But no one had expected them to cross this line. No one thought they would grab her when she passed their desks. No one believed they would laugh as Mason yanked the front of her blouse so hard the seams screamed before giving way. The sound of the tearing fabric had been louder than any shout. Miss Larkin's eyes closed. Her breathing grew ragged. A crimson flush climbed up her throat, her face, until she looked like she was on the verge of tears. Trey snickered. "Oh, sorry, miss, your little shirt must have been cheap." Few of the other boys laughed nervously. The girls stared in disbelief. No one moved to help her. But then something happened that no one in that room would ever forget. Miss Larkin slowly opened her eyes. They were no longer damp or frightened. They were clear, cool, and fixed on Mason and Trey as if she was seeing them, truly seeing them for the first time. When she spoke, her voice was steady as polished stone. "Get up." Mason's eyebrows rose. "What, you heard me," she said. "Stand up." A hush rippled through the class. Trey smirked and pushed back his chair with theatrical bravado. "What, you gonna cry at us some more?" But Miss Larkin didn't look like she was going to cry. She looked like someone who had made a decision and wasn't about to change her mind. "I warned you once," she said quietly. "I told you that laying your hands on someone is a line you never cross." She took a step forward. Mason looked uncertain now. Trey tried to puff himself up taller. "And I said if you ever did it again, there would be consequences." Mason scoffed, but the sound came out thin. "Yeah, right. What are you gonna do?" He never finished. Later, when the kids would tell the story over and over again, they'd describe how fast she moved, so fast her torn blouse fluttered behind her like a cape. She seized Mason's wrist, pivoted, and used his own weight against him. In the space of a single heartbeat, he flew up and over her shoulder, landing flat on his back with a thump so loud everyone flinched. Trey lunged toward her, red-faced, roaring something incoherent. Miss Larkin sidestepped, hooked her arm beneath his, and twisted. He toppled forward, face first onto the floor next to Mason, both of them dazed, gasping for air. Then the silence came back, bigger and heavier than before. Miss Larkin stood over them, breathing hard. One hand clutched the ripped edges of her blouse together, but her other hand hung at her side, steady and calm. Her voice was soft again. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I will not allow myself to be humiliated, or any of you, by anyone." She glanced around the room. Some of the students were blinking in awe, their mouths open. A few looked away, ashamed. No one dared move. Miss Larkin took a breath, helped them up. No one did, so she bent and hauled Mason gently to his feet. Then Trey. Both boys avoided her gaze. Mason's lip trembled, and Trey looked like he might throw up. She let go of their arms, and for a moment no one spoke. Then she walked over to her desk, retrieved her cardigan, and slipped it over her torn shirt. She straightened her spine and faced the class. "Sit," she said quietly, and they did. After the bell rang, the hallway buzzed with frantic whispers. The story was already sprinting ahead of her down the corridors, growing in drama with every telling. By lunchtime, everyone knew the new teacher had thrown 2 boys to the floor like it was nothing. But Miss Larkin didn't linger to hear it. She went straight to Principal Mallory's office. She reported exactly what had happened, her voice unwavering, even though her hands were still trembling. She insisted on documenting every detail. She requested that Trey and Mason's parents be called immediately. Principal Mallory, a tired woman who had seen too many teachers quit in her tenure, studied her for a long time. At last she nodded. "I'll handle the discipline," she said, her voice respectful in a way Miss Larkin hadn't expected. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here." Miss Larkin nodded. When she stepped back into the hall, her legs felt like rubber. She ducked into the staff bathroom and finally let herself cry, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But even as she wept, she felt something solid in her chest, a conviction she hadn't been certain she possessed. She had not come here to be a victim, and she would not be. The fallout was instant and fierce. Mason and Trey were suspended for a week. Their parents stormed the office, threatening lawsuits. But once the security camera footage was reviewed, grainy but undeniable, their tune changed. They offered reluctant apologies through gritted teeth. Miss Larkin accepted them. With a level gaze, word spread among the students. Some called her crazy. Others said she was brave. A few murmured that she must have studied martial arts, and they were right. For years, she had practiced judo, not for violence but for confidence, for discipline. was self-respect, but she had never imagined she would use it like this. The next morning when she entered homeroom, she felt the whole room holding its breath. Every student sat up straighter. Trey and Mason's empty seats were like warnings etched in invisible ink. She set her bag down slowly, looking out over them. Yesterday was difficult, she began. For all of us. No one interrupted. I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here to teach. I expect respect not just for me, but for yourselves and each other. You can choose to learn in this room, or you can choose to leave. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The students listened. Over the weeks that followed, something shifted in homeroom 7B. The sneers and side conversations shrank. The whisper campaigns dried up. It wasn't because Miss Larkin scared them. It was because, for the first time, they realized she was unbreakable. One afternoon, as a last bell rang, a girl named Kaylee lingered behind. She was shy. With thick glasses and sleeves she always pulled over her hands. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke. Miss Larkin. Yes, Kaylee. Kaylee twisted her fingers together. I thought it was really brave what you did. Miss Larkin felt a warmth spread through her. Thank you. My brother goes to another school, Kaylee said, her eyes darting to the floor. He says teachers don't stand up for themselves. But you did. Miss Larkin swallowed, her throat tight. Sometimes standing up is the only choice. Kaylee looked up, and for a moment, her shy smile was the most beautiful thing Miss Larkin had ever seen. I think it's cool. Thank you, Kaylee, she said again, her voice softer than she meant. When Kaylee left, Miss Larkin sat for a long time in the empty classroom. She looked around at the rows of desks, each one holding a life she had the power to shape. She thought of Mason and Trey, two boys who had learned, perhaps for the first time, that their actions had consequences. She thought of all the other kids, watching to see if she would crumble. And she thought of herself, of how she'd spent so much of her life believing that being gentle was the same as being weak. Now she knew the truth. Strength wasn't measured by how loud you shouted or how hard you hit. It was measured by whether you could face cruelty and not surrender your principles. Months passed. The school year wound on in its slow, grinding rhythm. Mason and Trey returned from suspension, sullen but subdued. They never apologized to her again, but they never tested her either. And over time she began to see flickers of something like respect in their eyes. One afternoon, when the final bell rang, Mason paused at her desk. His face was red, his hands jammed into his pockets. He cleared his throat. Just so you know, I signed up for wrestling. Miss Larkin looked up surprised. That's good, she said sincerely. You'll learn a lot. He shrugged, not meeting her eyes. Yeah, whatever. But as he turned away, she could see the tips of his ears pink with embarrassment. She smiled to herself. Maybe this was how change began, not with big, dramatic apologies, but with small, quiet shifts. When she locked up her classroom and stepped outside, the late spring sun warmed her face. She felt something lift in her chest, some burden she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For the first time since she'd walked into this school, she felt completely herself. Miss Larkin would never forget that day in September, when she'd stood in front of her students with her shirt torn open and her heart pounding. It had been the worst day of her life, and the best, because she had chosen not to shrink. She had chosen to stand her ground, and she knew, as surely as she knew her own name, that she would never choose differently. Years later, long after her first class had graduated and moved on, former students would write to her. Some would send cards, others would find her on social media. They all mentioned the same day, the day she